Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Sky. I am, as you can tell, a VTuber, and this is Historical VTuber Talks, where I talk about historical arms, armor, and various other things as a VTuber. So, this video has actually been a video that I wanted in the back of my mind to make for a really long time. I just never sort of found the time for it. As you know, I haven't really been uploading videos for a really long time. But recently, a few days ago, a video was made on this topic, initially by Scholar Gladiatoria. This video then received a response by Dequitum, another very interesting channel, and once again after that received a response to the response once again by Matt Easton from Scholar Gladiatoria. And I thought that this was the perfect time to actually come in here and share my thoughts on this. And what I'm going to be doing in this video is I'm going to be particularly focusing around what do historical sources tell us about this specific topic? Because I think that in these videos that Matt Easton did and that Dequitum did, they talk about their personal thoughts and experiences, but neither of them really went deeper into the actual sources that we have on this. I think that is important to do because the sources can tell us a lot. I personally do not have any experience with fighting in armor, so I cannot offer the viewpoint that Dequitum has. I personally do not own a replica of a medieval mace at the moment. It's something I'm planning to change in the future, but at the moment I do not own a replica of a medieval mace, so I cannot personally claim I know how it feels to use one compared to a sword. However, what I can do is I can present to you with the opinions of historical people who fought with these weapons and what they personally thought about them. Obviously, I do not know of every single source in existence, so what I'm going to be presenting here is going to be part of the picture. I'm going to try to present as big of a whole as I personally can of the sources I'm aware of, and I'm going to be talking about them and what they say, and later on I'm going to be sharing my personal thoughts on these sources, also in reference to the videos made by Scholar Gladiatoria and Dequitum, to sort of add on and talk about what I agree with and what I don't necessarily agree with that has been mentioned in these videos. So without further ado, let us get into it. The first thing to establish, and this was touched upon in both the video by Dequitum and the video by Scholar Gladiatoria, is that maces are not very popular fit combat weapons. And we can say this because if we look at the sources in late medieval Europe, we do not really see a lot of mentions or even the visual depictions of maces being used on foot. When it comes to dedicated foot soldiery, they almost always carry swords if they're carrying a sidearm, or knives, sometimes one-handed axes. But there is no source that I personally know of which systematically calls for infantry in the high or late medieval period to be armed with maces. We have equipment laws and regulations. We have, for example, the English Assize of Arms. The initial one was released in 1181, and then the second one was released in 1242, and then this was later updated in the Statute of Winchester of 1285. The first one does not make any mention of swords or maces whatsoever, just mentions spears. This is of arms of 1242, and this is of arms of 1285. And sorry, the Statute of Winchester of 1285 respectively, both call for the infantry who could afford it to be armed with swords. We also have other sources. For example, we have the Folkvapenslagar from late medieval Scandinavia and Sweden, particularly around the 14th century. The Folkvapenslagar that I'm aware of, and I will leave a source for this below, tend to talk about a few weapons that need to be owned by the general common man. Among these weapons is almost always a spear and a shield, and a sword. Sometimes you get the option between picking a sword and an axe, sometimes it's just sword, but never in a single one of these laws is a club or a mace or a hammer mentioned as the required weapon for an infantryman or as an option in these laws. They are saying spear, shield, and sword or axe. Of course, also they talk about armor as well, having a iron hat or a kettle hat, and textile armor is pretty common to request as well. Sometimes mail or plate are requested. These laws, you can find the mentions and more details about them in the thesis I will link to below. The thesis is by Thomas Negiman and talks about the Battle of Visby in 1361 and related sources. It's called the Gotlandic Rural Militia. I hate saying that word. I don't know why, but I for some reason never say the word rural properly. Anyway, we also have muster rolls. We have the Bridport muster of 1457. The Bridport muster recorded each and every one of the pieces of equipment that were brought by the inhabitants of Bridport to the muster. And in this document, we have over 110 swords mentioned. And we only have 3 mentions of lead maces. And keep in mind that historically speaking, a mace doesn't strictly just refer to the weapon we today call as mace with a round head. A mace in historical sources refers to all similar weapons, including hammers. These lead maces, or well, more likely to be lead hammers, are a relatively popular weapon which shows up sparingly from the 14th century onwards. I will link a blog below which calls it the Archer's Maul. Whether or not you can call it an Archer's Maul is debatable. It is, however, a popular weapon, among other things, with archers. And these tend to, in depictions, be larger two-handed polearm-likes rather than smaller one-handed maces carried on hip. So these 3 mentions of lead maces might not even possibly be talking about one-handed maces. It's quite possible that they're talking about larger polearms, even if the mention of these lead maces were to be assumed to be a sidearm. That is 3 recorded in the entire Bridport roll, as contrasted to like 120 swords or 110 swords or something along those lines. So definitely not a popular weapon in use by foot soldiers. I will also mention the Burgundian Ordinances 1470s. Once again, does not require maces for any of the crossbowmen, archers, mounted archers, or even the custiliers or the pikemen on foot. Neither of them are requested to have maces. They're all, however, requested to have swords. Now that we've established that it's not an infantryman's weapon, which I'm pretty sure that both Matt Easton and Dequitum are aware of already, what are they? Well, they're a heavy cavalryman's weapon. In fact, in the previously mentioned Burgundian ordinances, the ones that are required to show up with maces are the men-at-arms, the fully armoured cavalry. They are, besides the maces, also required to show up with longswords, with good points. That being said, pointy longswords, meant to be good at dealing with armour, and also swords on the saddle. And this is a trend that you will see more than once. If you were cavalry, it is not that uncommon to carry an additional saddle sword. This is a practice that we see way before the 15th century. I believe there's even examples of it in the 13th century. Most examples I personally know of are from the 15th or 16th, and I will talk about another one in a little bit later because it is relevant. Regardless, they're also told to carry saddle maces. This is also done in a 16th century French ordinance, where the men-at-arms are told to carry longswords, one-handed swords, and maces. So, this is the weapon of a heavy cavalryman. Does this not then mean that this is a weapon that is meant to be used against armour? Even on foot, by fully armoured cavalrymen, by these men-at-arms or knights, mentions of the usage of one-handed maces are scant. They're not non-existent, but they are rare. It's not the norm to expect somebody who fights dismounted on foot, even if they are a fully armoured cavalryman fighting against another fully armoured person. It's not expected for them to be using a one-handed mace. The sources very, very rarely mention this. Now, there is actually a mention from the late 16th century, 1584, by Diego Garcia de Perades, about the usage of a mace on foot. But note that in this, he says, "In this battle, a French captain turned to face me because I killed 2 of his brothers on the battlefield, and we fought in the middle of the 2 camps, arms at men-at-arms, with some iron maces that I brought out. The Frenchman, seeing the weight of them, threw his to the ground, being unable to wield it well, and seized hold of an estoc and lunged at me, thinking that I would not be able to wield the mace either. He stabbed me through the tasset and wounded me, and then struck him on the armet with the mace, and I sank it into his head, from which he fell down dead. Note specifically that the biggest point in this story is that the maces were really heavy. Heavy to the point where they seemed unwieldable. This does not sound like your average single-handed mace. It is quite unlikely that what is being talked about here is a conventional mace, and it is potentially possible that the word mace here is being used to be talked about a longer two-handed polearm. However, even if we assume that this is in fact talking about a smaller one-handed heavy mace, it shows that this is not an easy weapon to use, because one of the guys in the story literally threw his away in favor of the sword because he thought the sword would serve him better. This is not the only time that we see this turn up. In fact, let's talk about Pietro Monte. Pietro Monte was a 15th century Italian knight. He wrote down his thoughts and experiences regarding to knighthood, which was compiled into a book after his death, the Collectanea. In the Collectanea, Pietro Monte states that the principally used weapon on horseback by fully armed men-at-arms is the estoc. Even against people in full armor, it would seem that these two-handed pointy longswords were preferred. I should note here that when you hear the word estoc, you should not assume that this is a weapon without a cutting edge. I know that some people have the conception that estoc means there's a longsword without a cutting edge. This is not the case. Estoc in historical sources refers simply to very pointy longswords, which can and often did have cutting edges. Some estocs do not have cutting edges, but we primarily see this in the 16th century and in the late 15th century, where Pietro Monte is talking about the word estoc refers to usually pointy longswords. These still have cutting edges though, the longswords. Anyway, he says, according to him, that this is the most commonly used weapon on horseback by fully armored men-at-arms. In another source, by Juan Quijada de Real, a Iberian knight who wrote Doctrina dell'arte della cavalleria, the doctrine of the arch of chivalry, he mentions that according to him, you fight first with the lance, and once you've broken your lance, you draw your estoc, or longsword, and once you've broken your longsword, you draw your one-handed sword, and once you've broken your one-handed sword, that is when you draw your hammer. The specific word used here is martillo. So according to Juan Quijada, he prefers not only to use the two-handed sword above the mace, he prefers to use the one-handed sword above the mace or hammer as well. Now, this is not to say that everybody in the period would have had the same idea, but rather what I've provided here is I've provided 3 examples which show us that it wasn't abnormal, and in fact it is pretty normal for fully armored knights on horseback, not just on foot, but even on horseback, prefer to be fighting with their swords against other people in armor as opposed to the maces. What I do not want you to take this to mean is that this means that nobody would ever prefer to use a mace. There are most likely people who would primarily default to their mace if that was a weapon which they were personally more comfortable with. However, according to Pietro Monte, this would not be the norm. It would be less common for people to default to their mace after breaking their lance than would be to them to default to their sword. The mace should not be thought of as the best anti-armor weapon in existence in late medieval Europe. It was a weapon to be used in armored fighting. It was an option. However, it is an option that, according to personal preference and situation, might not serve you as well as a sword did, even against somebody in full armor. And this is very important to acknowledge because this is what the sources tells us. Now, the sources also tells us that maces can be pretty effective, particularly if you strike somebody on the head. However, Pietramonte also has another source. In it, he says, for anybody in a fight on horseback who fears that he will be struck with great blows by a club, it is good to insert under the helmet a very thin skull cap, which should be tempered, and it should be folded double in whatever direction, and it should not be broken and let itself be pierced easily. And in this way, even if the helmet is broken, this skull cap does not allow us to feel a blow on the head. This paragraph tells us two things. Number one is that being struck in the head by a mace, on horseback particularly, was still seen as a concern, and I will talk more about these sources and sources about being struck in the head with maces later. And secondly, it tells us that according to Pietramonte, there is ways you can mitigate it. So he says that if you wear a skull cap under your main helmet, then a mace strike against the head can be shrugged off. While on the topic of Pietramonte, he also says, and this is something that Dequitem mentioned in his video, is that it is difficult to wind up with a mace in close combat, and Pietramonte actually says this. He says that if you get in to somebody's range, that you can pretty much ignore any and all blows done by their axe, sword, or club, because they do not have the capacity to wind these weapons up and hit you properly. So Dequiem's point that he brought up against the mace on this is true. It is not simply mentioned for the mace, it is mentioned to be a problem with any weapon that is hard to wind up and hit someone in close combat, but it includes the mace. It is a weak point of the mace. It's also a weak point of the sword if you're trying to strike with your sword, but you obviously, in that situation, if you're very, very close, as Dequitem points out, you would like to thrust with the sword, and that is less of an issue. Now, there are sources which mention mace strikes against the head. I will link a document below done by a friend of mine who should be given credit for putting these sources together into one document. It seems to be relatively effective. Like, there are cases where people mentioned to be struck by maces on the head have a bad time. There are also cases where people mentioned to be struck by maces even on the head do not necessarily get knocked out of the fight immediately, even against the head. And the head is the primary target area for the mace. That is where you wish to strike if you can land it. Dequitem brings up a point that striking the joints of armor with a mace is not as effective as people think it is, and I would be inclined to agree with him, depending on the armor type. If you take a look at many of these armors, they have large couters, they have space in these areas. They are meant, they have couter fans, they have, essentially, they take great pains to ensure that any hit done against this area will be as mitigated as possible and not cause as much damage. That being said, you can still go for the joints, and if you hit them enough, you can still cause damage, but that's not to say that it is an automatic, easy way to do so. It means that it's still difficult. It is a target area, but it's not going to be effective as landing a hit on the head, or on the hands, on the fingers. Now, putting all of these sources together, I would say that the conclusions we can draw from them is this. The mace is considered a respectable weapon for a fully armored cavalryman, but it is common for the people to prefer the two-handed swords. Now, note that Matt in his video said that you do not want to strike with your sword against somebody's armor because you're afraid of it dulling or even potentially breaking. This is true. This is a concern. And there's actually a non-European source which talks about this exact concern in relation to swords and maces, and I will bring that up shortly. I want you to keep that in mind. But yes, it is a concern that if you strike against armor with a sword blade, it is a problem, and the sword blade can chip, break, or bend, or in other ways render unusable. However, note that one of the sources I mentioned, Juan Quiado de Riao, specifically expects this to happen. He mentions breaking your lance and then breaking your sword. He thinks that this is a thing which happened rather commonly. That is why he carries a significant amount of weaponry, because the weapons don't always last. So Matt is correct. Striking with a sword against armor is not good for the sword. But I wouldn't say he's correct in saying that because of that people didn't do it. Rather, I would say that according to the sources, it seems pretty clear that people did do it, and it did happen. And a tool is meant to be used after all. Not wanting your sword to break, I think, is more of a thing that we today in the modern day think, because obviously if we buy a sword, we don't want that shit to break. Like, we don't want it to break, we don't want to go get a new one. Those are expensive. But for somebody fighting in period, that expense is not much of a problem. You fight with a sword in a battle, and if it breaks, oh well. If you're a knight or a man-at-arms, you're carrying 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 backup weapons anyway, and that's when you draw them. So yeah, Matt has a point. You don't know, striking the armor is bad for the sword, but that doesn't mean that they didn't do it. It still seems to have happened pretty commonly. And as I said, there is an Arabic source, which I will come back to a little bit later, which also talks about this. And that being said, it is time to segue this conversation away from just medieval Western Europe, late medieval Western Europe to be precise, and segue a little bit more broadly in more time periods and also more geographic locations. Matt in his video mentions that maces are particularly popular around the 13th, 12th, 13th centuries, particularly when their male armor is around, and that is true. We do see maces used against male armor, and maces against male armor tend to be pretty effective. Even against male armor though, a good amount of sources talk about people using swords or daggers rather than maces. And even in the 12th, 13th centuries, we do not really see a lot of maces used on foot. The inherent disadvantages of the maces on foot are talked about by De Quittem, and they seem to have applied even in contexts where people are not wearing full plate armor, even against somebody with mail armor. The mace on foot is not necessarily the preferred weapon. On horseback though, they do tend to be pretty common. But let's talk a little bit about Eastern Europe and also the Turks, the Ottomans, and later I will also be talking about the Arabs, the Mamluks, and the Persians, the Indo-Persians, and maybe a little bit about China. When it comes to the Ottomans are mentioned, and we have sources for them, to be using large iron maces in the Turco-Persian Mongol tradition. Iron maces are common for a lot of traditions of warfare from Central Asia, and the Ottomans obviously developed their tradition of warfare from the Persians, which in turn had a lot of influence from the Mongols as well. So that whole area is intertwined with cultural influences and influxes, and the Ottomans were using heavy maces in a similar tradition to other people around Central and West Asia. This is mentioned by a Burgundian traveler by the name of Bertrand de Brouquier, who traveled to these areas, and he talks a little bit about the weapons in use, and he mentions that the weapons of the Ottomans, they were using maces, which, according to him, would be dangerous if struck on an unarmored or unguarded arm or on the shoulder, and he says, moreover says, I'm convinced that if struck upon the head of a person would stun a man. That is what he describes the Ottoman maces to be used as. So the heavy cavalry of the Turks were also carrying maces. But this is not the only armored combat weapon that the Turkish Bahi or cavalry were carrying. There is a lesser known sword that the Turks seem to have adopted from Eastern Europe. This sword is known as the mech. The word is thought to come from the Bulgarian word for sword, mesh, in a 15th century Ottoman treatise written by Firdevsi Rumi called the Silla Shortname. He talks about this sword. And this is a translation, once again, made by an acquaintance of mine. And this is what he says. It's necessary to know that there are 3 types of fighting with the sword. Firstly, if the sword is a mech, that is to say long and straight, you should draw the sword with your right hand in a swinging motion so that whoever gets hit gets sliced up. The first type is for when the sword has a dagger tip. When the enemy comes to fight you, you should pretend to swing your sword towards the enemy's head. When the enemy thinks he's being attacked and tries to cover his head, his chest will remain exposed, and at the moment you thrust with your sword. For people who say, I swung, but it didn't cut, are many, but no one can be found that says, I thrusted, but it didn't penetrate. Even if it happens less. In any situation, it is better to thrust than to swing. Let it be known that many have perished from thrusts. This seems pretty similar to how the Western Europeans are using their thrusting swords against armor. The mech is it is a thrusting sword. We have a few surviving ones from, for example, the 16th century. Here's one. This is an armored fighting weapon, and in this specific text, what the armor that is being talked about that is being thrust through is most likely mail. The Ottomans were using types of plates, and you would have a harder time thrusting through these plates, but mail armor was the absolute most commonly used by the Ottomans, and was probably one of the most common types of armor in Eastern Europe as a whole, and against those, thrusting swords like these could absolutely penetrate. This tradition in Eastern Europe of using large pointy thrusting swords no doubt has connection to Western European pointy swords, but moreover we can also see this in the later periods in the 16th, 17th centuries in use by the Polish hussars. The hussar, besides carrying the sabla, the saber, would also be carrying a long pointy sword by the name of konchers. And this is basically the same as the earlier Ottoman mech, a long, one-handed thrusting sword, meant to make it easier to deal with armor in a way the saber isn't quite suited. Although, I will talk more about sabers and the use against armor a little bit later. What do we note here? We do know that the Ottomans were using maces, the Ottoman cavalry were using maces, but they also had swords meant for armored fighting combat, which they adopted from Eastern Europe, because a lot of Ottoman soldiers in the first place were from Eastern Europe. Note that this text, the text mentioning the mech, is allegedly originally taken from Egyptian fighting manual. So while the mech sword itself is Turkish, it seems that there is a possibly earlier Egyptian text which also talks about thrusting swords, thrusting long straight swords used against armor in an Egyptian Mamluk context. Unfortunately, I do not know where this potential text might be. It is not hard to believe that, however, this treatise might have been translated from an earlier Egyptian Mamluk text, because the Mamluks do have treatises. The Arabs among North Africa tend to write treatises regarding armored cavalry combat. Much like the art of cavalry in Western Europe, we have something similar there, which even predates Islamic times, called furusiya. These are essentially the equivalent to Western chivalric martial combat. One such manual is made in the second half of the 14th century, around the year 1366, and is called Nihayat al-Sulwa al-Ummiya fi Tallam Amal al-Furusiya. I apologize if the pronunciation isn't quite correct. This translates essentially to compendium of quote-unquote chivalric martial arts or military arts. It specifically mentions the benefits of a mace against any other weapons, And this is what Matt talked about earlier. It says, it has many benefits that no other weapon has, because the user of the amud, which is the name for the mace, will not fear it breaking or dulling like the sword. The user of it strikes how he wants and however he wants, unlike other weapons. It then continues on to say, how should the wielder of the amud strike when he meets an armed man? He can break the lance, sword, bow, and shield, and smash the vambraces, the helmets, or the greaves, or even the joshin, which is the hard body armor that would have been used by monarchs during this time. So in this, we're specifically being told that the mace, according to this particular treatise, the steel mace, the amud, is considered an effective weapon against armor. And it does mention the very thing that Matt talked about, that with a sword, if you do this, you will fear it breaking or dulling. And this treatise talks about exactly that. It lists the upside of a mace as being exactly what Matt said. However, I would once again like to stress that we have plenty of reasons to think that people dulled and broke their swords against armor constantly anyway. So it's not to say that it wasn't done, merely that this particular text considers that to be a strength of the mace, which Matt also mentioned in his video. It is generally also said in some other treatises that the amud, particularly, is considered to be a difficult weapon to use. It is not the case that these manuals consider the amud to be an easy weapon to utilize to its full potential. It's a difficult weapon to use because it's mentioned to be very heavy in order to be as effective as the text claim for it to be, meaning that it is a weapon that you require skill and strength to wield. And if you do not have that skill or strength to wield this type of heavy mace, you might be better served off using a sword, even with the drawbacks that a sword has. But we have other texts. The treatise written by Mardi ibn Ali al-Tarsusi or Salah al-Din in the late 12th century says, the amud and the dabbus, which both are names for types of maces, are one of the most beneficial weapons which one can be used in war and one of the hardest hitting. And it rips muscles apart and breaks bones in such a way that even the lance heads and the swords cannot do. Another text says, on your target areas of the mace, that you're supposed to hit the head, or the front of the head, or his knees, or his horse, and you can also use it to hit the enemy's weapons, or smash his helmet, or his shield. Note that once again, we are talking about specific target areas that you need to strike with the mace. No doubt this is why the mace requires skill to use. It is not simply something you take and you strike anywhere on an armored opponent and expect it to have effect. It is still a skillful weapon, and utilizing it is in these Russia manuals pretty clearly considered to be a skill. Is it an effective weapon against armor in this particular context in North Africa? It is absolutely considered to be an effective weapon against armor, but it's not considered to be an easy weapon. It is considered to be a skillful weapon. And ironically enough, if somebody feels that they do not have the skill required to utilize one of these maces, it might be that they're defaulting to the sword, which was considered easier to use even against armor than something like an amud. Because we do know that people did constantly break their swords in battle. Earlier mention, a few centuries before this, by Khalid ibn al-Walid, which was a known military commander during the Islamic conquest, first fighting against the Islamic forces and then joining and fighting with the Islamic forces. In a poem, is mentioned to have broken 9 swords in a battle. Is breaking 9 swords an exaggeration? Probably. But what's interesting about this is that in order to explain just how good of a fighter he was, the author of the poem said that he broke 9 swords, which means that he was fighting very, very fiercely, and it was expected for swords to break, and if he broke 9 swords, he must have been fighting really, really fiercely. So, once again, maces are an effective weapon, and maces are very popular among particularly heavy cavalry all across North Africa and most of Asia. Regardless of this, swords were still utilized by the same heavy cavalry, also against armor, and were used to strike on the armor. And you can strike somebody's head with a sword, and you don't even necessarily have to do it with the blade. You can do it with the crossguard or with the pommel. That is always an option. And we do also see this done in these areas. So the maces were utilized, and one might say that the mace is probably more effective of a weapon against armor than a saber is. Even so, people were using these sabers against armored opponents. However, it should also be noted that it's very rarely that somebody wears armor that covers your entire body and leaves no gaps. Even in Western European plate armor, if somebody was expecting to fight on horseback, the back of the thighs are usually not that armored. Now, there are armors which do fully armor the back of the thigh, or there are cases where people wear mail on the back of the thighs, but there's also plenty of cases where the back of the thighs are left unarmored. The inside of the hands are usually not armored. And somebody who's armored on the face, you can still lift the visor. So there are weak spots like that. And if we take a look at Eastern armor, there's also weak spots in armor like this. Spots that you can throw a cut with your sword. And if you're not confident in your utilization of a mace, you can still take a saber and you can aim for these target areas. And even if they're mostly armored, you still have a few target areas you can strike with your saber. So sabers, even though far from an optimal weapon against an armored opponent, can still absolutely be used and were used against armored opponents. But regardless, maces were still very popular heavy cavalry weapons in these areas. And it's very, very common for a cavalryman to carry a lance, a bow, a shield, a mace, and a sword all together. We see this done with the Turks, we see this done with the Indo-Persians, the Mongols, and the Mamluks and other peoples of North Africa. This full set of weaponry is very common because they all have their uses. What I want to emphasize with this is that it should not be considered that a mace will always be an easy weapon to utilize against armor, because this is not necessarily the case. In order for a mace to be really effective against armor, the user still requires skill. It's a different skill set to what one requires with a sword. Regardless, it's still a skill set that you need to have in order to effectively fight with a mace against armor. And if you have that skill set in the context of Asia or North Africa, it was considered a very effective weapon. And yet in Western Europe, it would seem that because their swords developed particularly for armored combat in a way that they didn't necessarily in Asia, that even so, a sword was in many cases preferred over a mace if you had access to one. But the important here being that you were expected to lose your sword. Like, it wasn't uncommon, it was a common expectation to have that I might lose my sword, and then that it's a good idea to still carry a mace. Also, moreover, if you're not fighting other cavalry, say if you're fighting infantry on the ground, well, a mace is going to be pretty useful there because you can pull it out and then you can hit somebody at head level with the mace. It's a bit of a different context to if you are fighting and grappling with somebody on horseback, because yes, they did grapple on horseback. The available treatises for horseback combat specifically mention grappling on horseback to be a skill that you should have. And if you're standing there and if you're fighting somebody in full armor on horseback while standing still, then a sword might be the preferable weapon. But if you're riding and you're hitting people, then a mace might be the more preferred weapon. Note that all I said here is conjecture, because I do not actually know of a text which says that this is what maces were used for, but this is what I personally would interpret from the text, and what I personally would think would be a reasonable explanation to why you wish to carry both, and why maces should not be thought of as better against heavy armor than swords are. As I said, heavy cavalry carrying maces, common all across the world, all across Eurasia. As I said, heavy cavalry carrying maces were common all across Eurasia. We see this also done in China, where maces have cavalry. The Khitan and Jurchen cavalrymen carried both swords and maces. I think the conclusion should be that maces should not be thought of as simpler or easier weapons to use than swords. I do think that this reputation that they have is kind of unfounded, because you still need a skill set in order to effectively use a mace. And maces can be effective weapons for armored combat, but they're not necessarily preferred over swords if you've got swords that are optimized for armored combat. And even if you do not have swords that are optimized for armored combat, if you lack the skill with a mace, you will be better served using a sword that you're familiar with than using a mace that you might not be skilled with. So part of it comes down to personal preference, and part of it comes down to what other tools you have available at the moment. And I think that is my conclusions. I think based on the text that I have personally shared here, that is the most reasonable interpretation to draw. Of course, if you as a viewer have any further thoughts and comments to say about this, if you have any more sources that I'm not personally aware of, then by all means share. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I brought a few things, a few considerations and sources on the table that the discussion up until this point I believe lacked between Matt Easton and Equitum. And I think it's important not to overlook these historical accounts from people who actually dealt with these events and had experience with them. Because we in the modern day, we can have our own ideas, we can have our own conceptions based on our personal experiences. However, this will never actually match up and compare to somebody who was there and fought and wrote about the ways that they fought and the ways that they thought were effective to fight. So it's always important to pay important consideration to the historical texts. And if the historical texts contradict your own personal ideas of how things should be, then I think you should I think it's important to consider, why is this? And potentially, if the sources say something different to what I think, it may be that what I think isn't quite correct. I think that mindset is always important to have, to always defer and give the sources the consideration and the respect that they deserve. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. I do want to get back into making videos more consistently again. However, I have a lot going on, a lot of things that are taking up my attention. But there are other video topics that I have had in the back of my mind for a really long time, and that I do wish to make at some point. But until then, take care, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all some other time.